The Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol will be in order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Pursuant to House Deposition Authority Regulation 10, the chair announces the committee's approval to release the deposition material represented during today's hearing. Good afternoon. This is almost no idea more un-American than the notion that any one person could choose the American president. No idea more un-American. I agree with that, which is unusual because former Vice President Mike Pence and I don't agree on much. These are his words, spoken a few months ago about Donald Trump's attempt to pressure the former vice president, pressure him into going along with an unlawful and unconstitutional scheme to overturn the 2020 election and give Donald Trump a second term in office that he did not win. Today, the Select Committee is going to reveal the details of that pressure campaign. But what does the Vice President of the United States even have to do with a presidential election? The Constitution says that the Vice President of the United States oversees the process of counting the Electoral College votes, a process that took place on January 6, 2021. Donald Trump wanted Mike Pence to do something no other vice president has ever done. The former president wanted Pence to reject the votes and either declare Trump the winner or send the votes back to the states to be counted again. Mike Pence said no. He resisted the pressure. He knew it was illegal. He knew it was wrong. We're fortunate for Mr. Pence's courage on January 6th. Our democracy came dangerously close to catastrophe.
In our last hearing, we heard unequivocal testimony that President Trump was told his election fraud allegations were complete nonsense. We heard this from members of the Trump campaign. We heard this from President Trump's campaign lawyers. We heard this from President Trump's former Attorney General, Bill Barr. We heard this from President Trump's former acting Attorney General, Jeff Rosen. And we heard this from President Trump's former acting Deputy Attorney General, Richard Donahue. We heard from members of President Trump's White House staff as well. Today, we're focusing on President Trump's relentless effort to pressure Mike Pence to refuse to count electoral votes on January 6th. Here again is how the former vice president phrased it in a speech before the Federalist Society, a group of conservative lawyers.
This week, that President Trump said I had the right to overturn the election. But President Trump is wrong. I had no right to overturn the election. The presidency belongs to the American people and the American people alone.
What the president wanted the vice president to do was not just wrong. It was illegal and unconstitutional. We will hear many details in today's hearing, but please consider these 2 points. First, President Trump was told repeatedly that Mike Pence lacked the constitutional and legal authority to do what President Trump was demanding he do. This is testimony from Mark Short, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, who served in the Trump administration in multiple positions over 4 years.
But just to pick up on that, Mr. Short, was it your impression that the Vice President had directly conveyed his position on these issues to the President, not just to the world through a Dear Colleague letter, but directly to President Trump?
Many times.
And had been consistent in conveying his position to the President?
Very consistent.
But President Trump plotted with a lawyer named John Eastman to pressure Pence to do so anyway. As the federal court has explained, quote, based on the evidence, the court finds that it is more likely than not that President Trump and Dr. Eastman dishonestly conspired to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021. What exactly did President Trump know? When exactly did President Trump know that it would be illegal for Mike Pence to refuse to count electoral votes? Here is one sample of testimony given by one of the witnesses before us today, the Vice President's General Counsel.
Did John Eastman ever admit, or, in front of the president that his proposal would violate the Electoral Count Act?
I believe he did on the 4th.
That was January 4th, 2 days before the attack on Congress. A second point. Please listen to testimony today about all of the ways that President Trump attempted to pressure Vice President Pence, including Donald Trump's tweet at 2:24 p.m. condemning Vice President Mike Pence when President Trump already knew a violent riot was underway at the Capitol. In future hearings, you will hear from witnesses who were present inside the White House, who were present inside the West Wing on that day. But today we focus on the earnest efforts of Mike Pence, who was determined to abide by his oath of office. As Vice President Pence prepared a statement on January 5th and 6th, explaining that he could not illegally refuse to count electoral votes, he said this to his staff.
The Vice President had said, this may be the most important thing I ever say. And
This meaning the statement.
The statement.
I guess the hope is that there's such a show of force here that Pence will decide to do the right thing, according to Trump.
How did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where President Trump's most radical supporters led a violent attack on the Capitol and threatened to hang President Trump's own vice president? You'll hear from witnesses that Donald Trump pressured Mike Pence to adopt a legally and morally bankrupt idea that the vice president could choose who the next president can be. You'll hear about how the vice president, the White House counsel, and others told Donald Trump that the vice president had no such authority. But President Trump would not listen. You'll hear how Vice President Pence withstood an onslaught of pressure from President Trump, both publicly and privately. A pressure campaign that built to a fever pitch with a heated phone call on January 6th. You'll also hear that the president knew there was a violent mob at the Capitol when he tweeted at 2:24 p.m. that the vice president did not have the, quote, courage to do what needed to be done. Let me be clear. Vice President Pence did the right thing that day.
Judge J. Michael Luttig is one of the leading conservative legal thinkers in the country. He served in administrations of President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. He was appointed by the latter to serve on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, where he served from 1991 to 2006. He provided critical advice for Vice President Pence regarding the role of the Vice President in the joint session of Congress shortly before that fateful moment. He's written that the Vice President does not have the power to select the next President of the United States. He's also written that contrary theory espoused by one of his own former law clerks was, quote, incorrect at every turn. We're also joined today by one of the people who was with Vice President Pence on January 6th. Greg Jacob was counsel to Vice President Pence. He conducted a thorough analysis of the role of the Vice President in the joint session of Congress under the Constitution, the Electoral Count Act, and 230 years of historical practice. But President Trump did not like the outcome. He tried to pressure state legislatures to reverse the results of the election in their states, but they refused. He tried to enlist the Department of Justice in his efforts to overturn election results, but officials leading the department refused to comply. So eventually, he latched on to a completely nonsensical and anti-democratic theory that one man, his own vice president, could determine the outcome of the election. He wanted the vice president to unilaterally select the president. This theory that the vice president could unilaterally select the president runs completely contrary to our Constitution, our laws, and the entirety of our American experience. But that didn't matter to President Trump. I would now like to explore how President Trump came to latch on to this ridiculous legal theory that the Vice President can select the President of the United States. Mr. Jacob, how did this theory first come to your attention?
The first time that I had a conversation with the Vice President about the 12th Amendment and the Electoral Count Act was in early December, around December 7th. The Vice President called me over to his West Wing office and told me that he had been seeing and reading things that suggested that he had a significant role to play on January 6th in announcing the outcome of the election. And he asked me mechanically, how does this work at the joint session? So we concluded that what you have is a sentence in the Constitution that is inartfully drafted. But the Vice President's first instinct when he heard this theory was that there was no way that our framers, who abhorred concentrated power, who had broken away from the tyranny of George III, would ever have put one person, particularly not a person who had a direct interest in the outcome because they were on the ticket for the election, in a role to have decisive impact on the outcome of the election. And our review of text, history, and frankly just common sense all confirmed the Vice President's first instinct on that point. There is no justifiable basis to conclude that the Vice President has that kind of authority.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Judge Ludig, thank you as well for being here with us today. You issued a very important statement earlier today, which I urge all Americans to read. You say, had the Vice President of the United States obeyed the President of the United States, America would immediately have been plunged into what would have been tantamount to a revolution within a paralyzing constitutional crisis.
That passage in my statement this morning referenced the most foundational concept in America, which is the rule of law. Thus, as I interpret your question, you were asking about that foundational truth of these United States, which we call America. The foundational truth is the rule of law. That foundational truth is, for the United States of America, the profound truth. I believe that had Vice President Pence obeyed the orders from his president and the President of the United States of America during the joint session of the Congress of the United States on January 6, 2021, and declared Donald Trump the next President of the United States, notwithstanding that then President Trump had lost the Electoral College vote as well as the popular vote in the 2020 presidential election. That declaration of Donald Trump as the next president would have plunged America into what I believe would have been tantamount to a revolution within a constitutional crisis in America, which in my view, and I'm only one man, would have been the first constitutional crisis since the founding of the Republic.
Thank you very much, Judge, for your solemn attention to these issues and for your appearance here today. We're going to describe and discuss in detail what happened, and as we do, I'm going to describe a few of the details now of some of the actions taken by a gentleman named Kenneth Chesebro. After the Electoral College met and cast their votes on December 14th, actually the day before they met, Kenneth Chesebro sent a memo to Rudy Giuliani, the president's lead outside counsel. Mr. Chesebro wrote to Mayor Giuliani that the vice president is charged with, quote, making judgments about what to do if there are conflicting votes, close quote. Mr. Chesebro wrote that when the joint session of Congress got to Arizona in the alphabetical list of states, the vice president should not count the Biden votes, quote, because there are two slates of votes. His justification, which we will learn more about in our next hearing, was that a group of Trump supporters in Arizona and other swing states decided to proclaim themselves the true electors for the state, creating two sets of electors: the official electors selected by the state and a group of fake electors. This document was ordered to be produced to the Select Committee by a federal district court judge. As you will see on the screen shortly, Judge David Carter wrote, quote, the draft memo pushed a strategy that knowingly violated the Electoral Count Act. The judge concluded that, quote, the memo is both intimately related to and clearly advanced the plan to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021. Dr. Eastman says the vice president can reject the Biden electors from the states that he calls, quote, disputed. Under several of the scenarios, the vice president could ultimately just declare Donald Trump the winner, regardless of the vote totals that had already been certified by the states. However, this was false, and Dr. Eastman knew it was false. In other words, it was a lie. In fact, on December 19, 2020, just 4 days before Dr. Eastman sent this memo, Dr. Eastman himself admitted in an email that the fake electors had no legal weight, referring to the fake electors as, quote, dead on arrival in Congress, end quote, because they did not have a certification from their states. Judge Ludig, did the Trump electors in those 7 states who were not certified by any state authority have any legal significance?
Congresswoman, there was no support whatsoever in either the Constitution of the United States nor the laws of the United States for the vice president, frankly, ever to count alternative electoral slates from the states that had not been officially certified by the designated state official in the Electoral Count Act of 1887. I did notice in the passage from Mr. Eastman's memorandum, and I took a note on it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he said in that passage that there was both legal authority as well as historical precedent.
And Judge, I can read to you and to the audience, I think what was a really key passage from your very insightful analysis when you wrote, I believed that Professor Eastman was incorrect at every turn of the analysis in his January 2nd memorandum, beginning with his claim that there were legitimate competing slates of electors presented from 7 states, and you've already addressed that issue. But your next sentence said, continuing to his conclusion that the vice president could unilaterally decide not to count the votes from the 7 states from which competing slates were allegedly presented. So what was your basis for concluding that Dr. Eastman was incorrect in his conclusion that the vice president could unilaterally decide not to count the votes from these disputed states?
I understand. As I previously stated in response to Congresswoman Cheney, there was no basis in the Constitution or laws of the United States at all for the theory espoused by Mr. Eastman. At all. None. With all respect to my co-panelists,
I know in response to the chairman's earlier question, you gave your bottom line conclusion, but can you tell us a little bit about the process that you and your colleagues went through of researching this issue and what conclusion you came to after your thorough research?
So, you, as a lawyer who's analyzing a constitutional provision, you start with the constitutional text, you go to structure, you go to history. So we started with the text. We did not think that the text was quite as unambiguous as Judge Luttig indicated. In part, we had a constitutional crisis in 1876 because in that year, multiple slates of electors were certified by multiple slates. And when it came time to count those votes, the antecedent question of which ones had to be answered. That required the appointment of an independent commission. That commission had to resolve that question. And then we went to history. We examined every single electoral vote count that had happened in Congress since the beginning of the country. We examined the Electoral Count Act. We examined practice under the Electoral Count Act. And critically, no vice president in 230 years of history had ever claimed to have that kind of authority, hadn't claimed authority to reject electoral votes, had not claimed authority to return electoral votes back to the states. In the entire history of the United States, not once had a joint session ever returned electoral votes back to the states to be counted. And in the crisis of 1876, Justice Bradley of the United States Supreme Court, who supplied the decisive final vote on that commission, had specifically looked at that question and said, first, the vice president clearly doesn't have authority to decide anything, and by the way, also does not have authority to conduct an investigation by sending things back out for a public look at things. So the history was absolutely decisive, and again, part of my discussion with Mr. Eastman was, if you were right, don't you think Al Gore might have liked to have known in 2000 that he had authority to just declare himself president of the United States? Did you think that the Democrat lawyers just didn't think of this very obvious quirk that he could use to do that? And of course, he acknowledged Al Gore did not and should not have had that authority at that point in time. But so text, structure, history, I think what we had was some ambiguous text that common sense and structure would tell you the answer cannot possibly be that the vice president has that authority. As the committee already played the vice president's remarks, there is almost no idea more un-American than the notion that any one person would choose the American president. And then unbroken historical practice for 230 years that the vice president did not have such an authority.
Thank you. I reserve the remainder of my time.
Mr. Jacob, you weren't the only one who knew that the legal theory was wrong, though. Let me explain. On the screen, you can see a draft letter to the president from October 2020. In this letter, an idea was proposed that the vice president could determine which electors to count at the joint session of Congress. But the person writing in blue eviscerates that argument. The person who wrote the comments in blue wrote, quote, "The 12th Amendment only says that the President of the Senate opens the ballots in the joint session and then, in the passive voice, that the votes shall then be counted." The comments in blue further state, "Nowhere does it suggest that the President of the Senate gets to make the determination on his own." And I think it kind of begs the question that if the vice president had this power to determine the outcome of a presidential election, why hasn't it ever been used before? Why hasn't that ever happened? Why hasn't a vice president simply rejected the outcome of an election and declared someone else the winner? And instead, as the chairman mentioned in his opening, for over 2 centuries, vice presidents have presided over the joint sessions of Congress in a purely ceremonial role. This even includes, as Mr. Jacob mentioned, Vice President Al Gore. For those of us who are old enough to remember, the 2000 election came down to one state, Florida. There were weeks of recounts and litigation after the election, and Al Gore conceded. Of course, Al Gore was vice president at the time, but he never suggested that he could simply declare himself the winner of the 2000 election when he presided over the counting of the electoral votes. Let's hear what Vice President Gore said when he described the situation he faced in 2000.
Importance of the United States of America in all of human history. In Lincoln's phrase, we still are the last best hope of humankind. And the choice between one's own disappointment in your personal career and upholding the noble traditions of America's democracy is a pretty easy choice when it comes down to it.
Speaker Ryan wanted to call and say, you know, you don't have any greater authority. And I said to him, Mr. Speaker, you know, Mike, you know, he recognizes that. And we sort of laughed about it. And he said, I get it. And he later spoke to the vice president, too, to, I think, have the same conversation.
Fortunately for the fate of our republic, Vice President Pence refused to go along with President Trump's demands that he determine the outcome of the presidential election. Mr. Jacob, what was the vice president's reaction when you discussed with him the theory that the vice president could decide the outcome of the election?
Congressman, as I've testified, the vice president's first instinct was that there was no way that any one person, particularly the vice president who is on the ticket and has a vested outcome in the election, could possibly have the authority to decide it by rejecting electors or to decisively alter the outcome by suspending the joint session for the first time in history in order to try to get a different outcome from state legislatures.
Despite the fact that the vice president had a strongly held and correct view that he could not decide the outcome of the election, President Trump launched a multi-week campaign of both public and private pressure to get the Vice President Mike Pence to violate the Constitution. Here are some examples of the intense pressure the Vice President faced from all sides and what his Chief of Staff thought of it.
I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great Vice President comes through for us.
The Vice President really was not wavering in his commitment to what his responsibility was. And so, yeah, was it painful? Sure.
On December 23rd, President Trump retweeted a memo from an individual named Ivan Reichland entitled Operation Pence Card that called on the vice president to refuse the Electoral College votes from certain states that had certified Joe Biden as the winner. President Trump started his pressure campaign in December, but he dialed up the pressure as January 6th approached. The testimony we have received in our investigation indicates that by the time January 4th arrived, President Trump had already engaged in a, quote, multi-week campaign to pressure the vice president to decide the outcome of the election. This had included private conversations between the two leaders, Trump's tweets, and at least one meeting with members of Congress. We understand that the vice president started his day on January 4th with a rally in Georgia for the Republican candidates in the U.S. Senate runoff. When the vice president returned to Washington, he was summoned to meet with the president regarding the upcoming joint session of Congress. Mr. Jacob, who attended that meeting?
The attendees were the vice president, the president, Mark Short, the chief of staff to the vice president, myself, and John Eastman. There was about a 5-minute period where Mark Meadows came in on a different issue.
Mr. Jacob, during that meeting between the president and the vice president, what theories did Dr. Eastman present regarding the role of the vice president in counting the electoral votes?
During the meeting on January 4th, Mr. Eastman was opining that there were two legally viable arguments as to authorities that the vice president could exercise 2 days later on January 6th. One of them was that he could reject electoral votes outright, but that the vice president could sort of issue a demand to the state legislatures in those states to re-examine the election and declare who had won each of those states. So he said that both of those were legally viable options. He said that he did not recommend, upon questioning, he did not recommend what he called the more aggressive option, which was reject outright, because he thought that that would be less politically palatable. The imprimatur of state legislature authority would be necessary to ultimately have public acceptance of an outcome in favor of President Trump. And so he advocated that the preferred course of action would be the procedural route of suspending the joint session and sending the election back to the states.
Mr. Jacob, I know you won't discuss the direct conversations between the president and the vice president. So rather than asking you what the vice president said in that meeting, I'll ask you a more general question. Did the vice president ever waver in his position that he could not unilaterally decide which electors to accept?
The vice president never budged from the position that I have described as his first instinct, which was that it just made no sense from everything that he knew and had studied about our Constitution that one person would have that kind of authority.
And did the vice president ever waver in his position that he could not delay certification and send it back to the states?
No, he did not. And I said, John, basically what you have is some text that may be a little bit ambiguous, but then nothing else that would support it, including the fact that nobody would ever want that to be the rule. Wouldn't we lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court? And again, he initially started, well, maybe you'd only lose 7-2, but ultimately acknowledged that no, we would lose 9-0. No judge would support his argument.
After his meeting with the vice president, Donald Trump flew to Georgia for a rally in support of the Republican candidates in the United States Senate runoff. Even though the vice president had been steadfast in resisting the president's pressure, President Trump continued to publicly pressure Vice President Pence in his Georgia speech. Rather than focusing exclusively on the Georgia Senate runoff, Trump turned his attention to Mike Pence. Here's what the president said during that rally in Georgia.
Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
I did not think that this was a political question. Among other things, if the courts did not step in to resolve this, there was nobody else to resolve it. You would be in a situation where you have a standoff between the President of the United States and, counterfactually, the Vice President of the United States, saying that we've exercised authorities that constitutionally we think we have, by which we have deemed ourselves the winners of the election. You would have an opposed House and Senate disagreeing with that. You would have state legislatures that, to that point, Republican leaders across those legislatures had put out statements, and we collected these for the vice president as well, that the people had spoken in their states and that they had no intention of reversing the outcome of the election. We did receive some signed letters that Mr. Eastman forwarded us by minorities of leaders in those states, but no state had any legislative house that indicated that it had any interest in it. So you would have had just an unprecedented constitutional jump ball situation with that standoff. And as I expressed to him, that issue might well then have to be decided in the streets. Because if we can't work it out politically, we've already seen how charged up people are about this election. And so it would be a disastrous situation to be in. So I said, I think the courts will intervene. And he said, look, as graduates of that august institution, you and I will mutually understand that the underlying legal theory of plenary vice presidential authority is what you have to get there. Because this new theory, as I was pointing out to him, or the procedural theory, still violates several provisions of the Electoral Count Act, as he acknowledged. And the only way that you could ever be able to ignore several provisions of statutory law is if it was pretty clear that they were unconstitutional. And the only way they could be unconstitutional is if the vice president had the plenary authorities that were formed the basis for the reject the votes as well. So he acknowledged in those conversations that the underlying legal theory was the same.
Mr. Jacob, the president and the vice president meet again on that same topic the next day, January 5th, correct?
So after my extended meeting with Mr. Eastman that morning, during that time, the vice president had been back at his residence working on his statement to the nation that we released the next day. He got down to the White House some point between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock as my meeting with Mr. Eastman was wrapping up. And when Mark Short and I went over to meet with the vice president, and actually we thought maybe we had good news, but the vice president was then asked down to the Oval Office, and he went down to the Oval Office while Mark and I stayed back in the vice president's office.
You weren't in that meeting.
I was not.
In the book Peril, journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa write that the president said, quote, "If these people say you have the power, wouldn't you want to?" The vice president says, quote, "I wouldn't want any one person to have that authority." The president responds, "But wouldn't it almost be cool to have that power?"
We were not going to be rejecting electors, but would we be open to considering the other course that we had discussed on the 4th, which would be to suspend the joint session and request that state legislatures re-examine certification of the electoral votes?
That same day, January 5th, the New York Times ran a story about the disagreement between the president and the vice president about whether the vice president could determine the outcome of the election. Even though the New York Times story was indisputably correct, Donald Trump denied it. Trump issued a statement claiming that the vice president had agreed that he could determine the outcome of the election, despite the fact that the vice president had consistently rejected that position. Let's look at what the president said in his statement. Quote, "The New York Times report regarding comments Vice President Pence supposedly made to me today is fake news. He never said that. The vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act." Mr. Jacob, how did the vice president's team react to the statement from the president that the vice president could take an active role in determining the winner of the presidential election?
So we were shocked and disappointed because whoever had written and put that statement out, it was categorically untrue.
Vice President's Chief of Staff Mark Short had an angry phone call with Trump campaign senior advisor Jason Miller about this statement. The dispute between the president and the vice president had grown to the point where the vice president's Chief of Staff Mark Short was concerned that the president could, in Mr. Short's words, quote, "lash out" at the vice president on January 6th. In fact, Mr. Short was so concerned about it that he talked with the head of the vice president's Secret Service detail on January 5th. Here's Mr. Short.
Concern was for the vice president's security, and so I wanted to make sure the head of the vice president's Secret Service was aware that that likely, as these disagreements became more public, that the president would lash out in some way.
I'd now like to turn to the events of January 6, 2021, which turned out to be a fateful day in our nation's history. Despite the fact that the vice president consistently told the president that he did not have and would not want the power to decide the outcome of the presidential election, Donald Trump continued to pressure the vice president, both publicly and privately. As you will hear, things reached a boiling point on January 6th, and the consequences were disastrous. In the middle of the night, on January 5th, into the morning of the 6th, around 1 a.m., President Trump tweeted at the vice president, meaning that the comments in response to the president's tweet would also show up on the vice president's Twitter feed. The tweet stated that the vice president could, quote, "come through for us," and send it back to the states. Then around 8 a.m. on January 6th, President Trump again tweeted, this time to say that the vice president could send it back to the states and, quote, "we win," and that this is the time for extreme courage. Mr. Short told us during his deposition that the Vice President started a meeting on January 6th in prayer. We understand that congressional leaders and others were evacuated from the Capitol complex during the attack. We'd like to show you what happened after the Vice President was evacuated from the Senate.
Select Committee has obtained never-before-seen photos from the National Archives that show Vice President Pence sheltering in a secure underground location as rioters overwhelmed the Capitol. At 4:19 p.m., Vice President Pence is seen looking at a tweet the President had just sent, a tweet asking the rioters to leave the Capitol. After 4.5 hours spent on working to restore order, the Vice President returned to the Senate floor to continue the certification of electors.
So Vice President Pence was a focus of the violent attack. Mr. Jacob, did the Vice President leave the Capitol complex during the attack?
He did not. And the Vice President had said something to the effect of, Tim, I know you, I trust you, but you're not the one behind the wheel. And the Vice President did not want to take any chance that the world would see the Vice President of the United States fleeing the United States Capitol. He was determined that we would complete the work that we had set out to do that day, that it was his constitutional duty to see through, and that the rioters who had breached the Capitol would not have the satisfaction of disrupting the proceedings beyond the day on which they were supposed to be completed.
You hit send on an email to John Eastman explaining why his legal theory about the Vice President's role was wrong. You ended your email by stating that, quote, thanks to your bullshit, we are now under siege. We'll take a look at that email. And Dr. Eastman replied, and this is hard to believe, but his reply back to you was, the siege is because you and your boss, presumably referring to the Vice President of the United States, did not do what was necessary to allow this to be aired in a public way so the American people can see for themselves what happened. Mr. Jacob, later that day you wrote again to Dr. Eastman. Let's show that email on the screen. In that email, you wrote, and I quote, did you advise the President that in your professional judgment, the Vice President does not have the power to decide things unilaterally? And you ended that email saying, it does not appear that the President ever got the memo. Dr. Eastman then replied, he's been so advised. And he ends his email with, quote, but you know him, once he gets something in his head, it's hard to get him to change course.
Late that evening, after the joint session had been reconvened, the Vice President had given a statement to the nation saying that violence was not going to win, freedom wins, and that the people were going to get back to doing their work. Later that evening, Mr. Eastman emailed me to point out that in his view, the Vice President's speech to the nation violated the Electoral Count Act, that the Electoral Count Act had been violated because the debate on Arizona had not been completed in 2 hours. Of course, it couldn't be since there was an intervening riot of several hours. And that the speeches that the majority and minority leaders had been allowed to make also violated the Electoral Count Act because they hadn't been counted against the debate time. And then he implored me, now that we have established that the Electoral Count Act isn't so sacrosanct as you have made it out to be, I implore you one last time, can the Vice President please do what we've been asking him to do these last 2 days, suspend the joint session, send it back to the states.
And we'll show you the text of that email, which Dr. Eastman wrote at 11:44 p.m. on January 6th. So after the attack on the Capitol and after law enforcement had secured the Capitol, he still wrote, as you described, quote, so now that the precedent has been set that the Electoral Count Act is not quite so sacrosanct as was previously claimed, I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation and adjourn for 10 days to allow the legislatures to finish their investigations. So even after the attack on the Capitol had been quelled, Dr. Eastman requested, in writing no less, that the vice president violate the law by delaying the certification and sending the question back to the states. Is that correct, Mr. Jacob?
It is.
Did you eventually share Dr. Eastman's proposal with Vice President Pence?
Not right at that time, because the vice president was completing the work that it was his duty to do. But a day or two later, back at the White House, I did show him that final email from Mr. Eastman.
The votes for President of the United States are as follows. Joseph R. Biden, Jr. of the state of Delaware has received 306 votes. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 232 votes. The whole number of electors appointed to vote for Vice President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, a majority is 270. The votes for Vice President of the United States are as follows. Kamala D. Harris of the state of California has received 306 votes. Michael R. Pence of the state of Indiana has received 232 votes. The announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons elected President and Vice President of the United States, each for the term beginning on the 20th day of January, 2021, and shall be entered together with the list of the votes on the journals of the Senate and the House of Representatives.
Mr. Jacob, we heard earlier that you and the Vice President and the team started January 6th with a prayer. So let's see what Dr. Eastman did as a result when he was deposed by this committee.
I assert my Fifth Amendment right against being compelled to be a witness against myself.
Did the Trump legal team ask you to prepare a memorandum regarding the vice president's role in the counting of electoral votes at the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2020? Dr. Eastman, did you advise the President of the United States that the vice president could reject electors from 7 states and declare that the president had been reelected? Dr. Eastman, the first sentence of the memo starts off by saying 7 states have transmitted dual slates of electors to the President of the Senate. Is that statement in this memo true?
Yes.
Did President Trump authorize you to discuss publicly your January 4th, 2021 conversation with him? So is it your position that you can discuss in the media direct conversations you had with the President of the United States, but you will not discuss those same conversations with this committee?
Yes.
Dr. Eastman pled the Fifth 100 times. Finally, let's hear from a federal court judge, the only one to date who has opined on whether the president was involved in criminal activity. Page 36 of Judge Carter's ruling says, quote, based on the evidence, the court finds it more likely than not that President Trump corruptly attempted to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021. Page 40 of the ruling says, quote, based on the evidence, the court finds that it is more likely than not that President Trump and Dr. Eastman dishonestly conspired to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021. And page 44, Dr. Eastman and President Trump launched a campaign to overturn a Democratic election, an action unprecedented in American history. Their campaign was not confined to the ivory tower. It was a coup in search of a legal theory.
The short term I previously described, a constitutional jump ball situation, political chaos in Washington, lawsuits, and who knows what happening in the streets. And you would have had the Vice President of the United States having declared that the outcomes of these state elections were incorrect. So for all of those reasons, there would have been significant short-term consequences. But in the long term, we would have established a situation where a vice president would have asserted that one person could have the authority to determine the outcome of an election, which is antithetical to everything in our democracy, is antithetical to the rule of law. And so it would have been significant impacts, both in the short and the long term.
We have seen so far in our hearings that President Trump knew that his claims of a stolen election were false. You have seen that he knew that Mike Pence could not legally refuse to count electoral votes, And you have seen what President Trump did to pressure Mike Pence into taking illegal action. Over the course of our next hearings, you will see information about President Trump's efforts, John Eastman efforts, the Trump legal team's efforts to apply pressure to Republican state legislatures, state officials, and others. Judge Carter has recently written, quote, Dr. Eastman's actions in these few weeks indicate that his and President Trump's pressure campaign to stop the electoral count did not end with Vice President Pence. It targeted every tier of federal and state elected officials. We will examine all of those threats, and we will examine the Trump team's determination to transmit materially false electoral slates from multiple states to officials of the executive and legislative branches of our government. We will examine the pressures put on state legislatures to convene to reverse lawful election results.
Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.